Revenge on my ex-husband and his son for cheating on them. I'm Amy. I thought I had made a very terrible mistake and only later found out the truth. I was allegedly caught cheating on my rich husband and was kicked out of the marriage, leaving nothing but a prenup. What followed was nothing but humiliation until... I think I had a relatively typical middle-class childhood, although I wasn't too into girly things. I was a pretty good athlete and must have had a decent body considering all the guys who hit on me. However, I was always a good girl and gave my virginity to my first love and first husband, John. John and I got married too early, fresh out of high school. I continued to be a good girl and never cheated. One of the things about marrying too young, especially against family advice, is that we didn't realize how much work it takes to hold down a low-skilled job and keep a marriage interesting. We only lived for 3 years and divorced by mutual consent, with virtually no assets to divide. I wanted to go back to school to get some college education, but I really couldn't stand living with my parents as a loser, and after a 2-month transition period where I was forced to live with them, I started looking for a way out. After my divorce, I was doing a low-level retail sales job and living at home when I met Charlene Peters. She was sophisticated and poised, and I immediately took a liking to her. After we had known each other for about 2 months, her roommate moved and Charlene suggested I take her place. I quickly accepted. Charlene sold cosmetics, mostly in stores and to some individuals. She experimented with me and said that when I wore decent makeup, I looked attractive. She may have been right, because when I went to work after Charlene did my makeup, I was noticed by a lot of men, so much so that my boss forbade me to wear anything more than a simple lipstick to work. Charlene not only experimented on me, but taught me a lot about makeup and other beauty products, and I absorbed it like a sponge. In addition to learning everything Charlene could teach me, I enrolled in a cosmetology course on the art of makeup at the local community college. I didn't have the time or money to get an associate's degree in cosmetology, but the one course I did take helped a lot. Charlene told me that I should get a job in the cosmetology department of one of her clients, a job that would pay me twice what I was making, and I would also be dealing with a more healed clientele. After a thorough interview in which I was asked all sorts of detailed questions about cosmetics, I was hired on the spot and started working the next day in the cosmetics department of an expensive store that I will refer to as Nordstrom, even though it is not. My personal life was at an all-time high both before and after I started working at Nordstrom. I was hit on even more often during that time than I was in high school, and I had my share of good love experiences, though I hadn't found someone I wanted to be in a long-term relationship with. And then I was swept off my feet by Chauncey Crichton. Why Chauncey Crichton ended up at Nordstrom's with his sister-in-law Megan, I have no idea, but he was there. Chauncey was 43 years old at the time, and I was 25. From the way he dressed and talked, he was clearly from the wealthy. Although he didn't have the body of an athlete, he was handsome, and at first I couldn't believe that someone like him could show interest in me. However, the whole time I was helping Megan by applying various expensive cosmetics to her face so she could visualize what she would look like, he was chatting with me. After paying for Megan's makeup, he left with her, but returned a minute later and invited me to dinner Friday night. I accepted. I'll admit I was impressed with Chauncey's lifestyle. Had I been more sophisticated as a child, I might have realized how superficial he was. However, with stars in my eyes, I accepted his marriage proposal after 6 months of dating, even though he wasn't that great in bed and seemed more interested in his pleasure than mine. Of course, I had to sign a prenup, but apparently because of my unsophistication and fascination with Chauncey's lifestyle, I didn't read it as carefully as I should have. Having lived most of my life simply, I quickly adjusted to a life of privilege. Since I was quite good-looking and had nice C-plus cup-size breasts, Chauncey seemed to take great pleasure in showing me off to his male friends, sometimes even to my embarrassment. However, I had trouble making friends with women from the social circles in which Chauncey revolved. For the most part, my life was good, financially, of course, although I never developed a liking for Chauncey's arrogant son Mitchell, who was my age. I did, however, develop a decent relationship with Mitchell's wife Megan, whom I met at the same time as Chauncey at a Nordstrom cosmetics store. My life with Chauncey effectively ended when, after 18 months of trying, I discovered I couldn't have children due to, as my OBGYN put it, structural problems in your reproductive system. I never understood exactly what that meant, but I agreed with her diagnosis. Until that point, I didn't know how interested Chauncey was in having at least 2 more children besides his adult son, Mitchell, and I never learned why other children were so important to him. It upset me that Chauncey became cool towards me when we agreed to go on vacation to the Bahamas. I thought it would be a way to repair our relationship. Only much later did I learn that it was Chauncey's way of dumping me without any economic consequences. While Chauncey was busy playing golf, he set me up with a tour group led by Julian, a guy about my age originally from Boston. Julian was handsome, and frankly, I was flattered that he paid much more attention to me than the other 15 or so tourists in our group, even though 5 or 6 of them were pretty college girls. After the tour, he took me out to lunch about half an hour after it was over. He handed out pieces of paper with an address on them. Mine showed the hotel I was staying at. I called Chauncey on his cell phone to see when he was done playing golf, and he told me he was going to play another 18 holes, so it was okay to go to lunch. When I got to lunch, I was surprised that I was the only one there. Julian was also surprised, but simply asked the hostess at the hotel restaurant to give us a table for 2 instead of the table for 10 that he had supposedly reserved. Julian really cared about my happiness, and when our waitress proved too slow for his taste, went to the bar himself to refill our rum drinks. Julian was so sweet that I didn't immediately realize I was feeling a little dizzy. Julian asked if anything was wrong, quickly paid the bill, and then offered to help me up to my room. As Julian undressed me in my room, I tried to stop him, but not only was my body not responding properly, but my words were slurred. It was then that I realized he had drugged me, but it was too late. The only good thing that happened over the next hour was that I had sex properly for the first time in a long time. I either blacked out or fell asleep, but I woke up to what appeared to be an angry Chauncey shaking me and calling me a cheater, among other names. I regained consciousness surprisingly quickly and realized I was lying unclothed on the bed in our hotel room. One of Chauncey's friends, with a big grin on his face, was standing behind Chauncey and yelling at me. I covered myself, and when Chauncey's tirade subsided, I told him that I had been drugged and had sex with me against my will. He laughed it off, but after building up my courage, I demanded he take me to the hospital for a blood test, one of the few times in our marriage. After making a phone call, Chauncey agreed. I got dressed, his jerk friend refused to leave while I did, and the 3 of us, I didn't know why we needed this friend, took a cab to the local hospital. I was surprised at how kindly the hospital administrator and the doctor drawing my blood treated Chauncey and me like a piece of meat. We sat in the administrator's office and didn't talk about anything until the orderly came in with the test results about an hour after the blood draw. The receptionist looked over the test and said, "No drugs, although there is some alcohol." I snatched the paper out of his hands, trying to see if there was an obvious error. The text read, "A negative," which was my blood type, and the top of the sheet read, "Amy Crichton." But I couldn't believe the negative results for a dozen different drugs, including GHB. I noticed Chauncey and the receptionist exchange sly, understanding smiles, the significance of which I didn't realize until much later. On the cab ride back to the hotel, Chauncey informed me that he was divorcing me and that he had to fly home early and be out of the house by the time I got back. I waited until I got back to our room before I cried. I didn't want Chauncey or his asshole friend to see me. On the way back, I was a mess. Long story short, Chauncey divorced me, invoking the morals clause in the prenup, which, as I sadly only found out at the time, was one-sided. Only for me, not for him. We divorced 3 months later, and after 2.5 years of marriage, I had almost nothing left. Perhaps I could have made money working full-time at a Nordstrom cosmetics store if I still had the same tastes I had before I married Chauncey. But I didn't anymore. 6 months later, I ran out of money and received an eviction notice from my apartment. It was then that I ran into Beatrice, one of the women who was part of Chauncey's group of friends. Beatrice was a pretty woman who had married an old man Toad, apparently for his money. She and I hadn't been particularly friendly while I was married to Chauncey, but she wasn't arrogant toward me either, which put her in the top half of the people I'd met while I was married to Chauncey. Seeing her now, post-divorce, I was surprised that Beatrice was remarkably friendly. She treated me to lunch at a restaurant I could no longer afford, and after I'd had 2 drinks, inquired about my circumstances. I'm working part-time in the cosmetics department at Nordstrom in hopes of getting my full-time job back, but I'm having a really hard time making ends meet because my tastes have changed since my marriage to Chauncey, I complained. I'd like to let you in on a little secret, Beatrice whispered with a giggle. Promise not to tell anyone, and I'll tell it to you. I was intrigued, so as I sipped my 3rd glass, I replied, I promise. Some of us society women who have husbands we can't attract, and some of our single girlfriends, have a small side business. It's fun and brings us good money for expenses that we don't have to account to our husbands for. Would you like to know more? Replied Beatrice. Sure, I replied, taking a sip from my 3rd glass. We have a small escort service. Those of us who are married mostly work with out-of-town businessmen staying in expensive hotels. However, the unmarried members of our group also participate in local events and earn a lot of money, she smiled. Of course, even after 3 drinks, I knew what she was talking about. But I asked anyway. By escort services, do you mean call girls? Beatrice smiled radiantly. Some of us only escort, others have sex. After a long delay while we looked at each other, she asked with a wry smirk on her face. Interested? Maybe, I replied. After further discussions over the next few days, with Beatrice and Susan, a woman I had never met but who was in charge of the escort services business, in the face of a rapidly approaching eviction, I concluded that this was a lifeline I should accept, especially since in the meantime Nordstrom was reducing my hours rather than increasing them. Susan loaned me $2,500 so I wouldn't get evicted and starve to death, and booked me for that weekend only as an escort. The organization Susan ran was called Events, Inc., and there were 2 classes of contractors, the nice and the daring. The daring ones were confident about sex, and payment for them was made up front. With the sweet ones, the client didn't expect sex, but the sweet women were of age, and what they did at the end of the evening was their business, as long as they gave Event, Inc. a cut the next day. I was in the sweet group. I spent the next 6 weeks working as an escort, being the sweetie for older gentlemen who needed a date for one event or another. I rarely encountered people from Chauncey's circle, but when I did, I was surprised by their hospitality and sometimes even their friendliness. I had already paid off Susan and was making more money than when I was working full-time at Nordstrom without straining my back, but it still wasn't enough to have the lifestyle I wanted. Then I met Richard Hawkins. Richard wasn't exactly ordinary. He was young, a year younger than me, big, bold, and handsome, and obviously born into money, though he seemed to have made it himself as a Princeton graduate. He had traveled from out of town to attend a big charity ball in our big city. He treated me very well at the ball, was a skillful dancer, and refused to call my name when others asked me to dance, for which I smiled broadly at him. When the event was almost over, we left. As we rode in the limo, Richard kissed me and said, "I don't want this night to end. I know you're not on the brave side of Event, Inc., but I really need to have sex with you. If you stay the night, I'd like you to buy yourself something nice." It was his way of paying for sex without really paying for it. He pulled $100 bills out of his wallet and slipped them into my hand. I didn't really have to make a decision. I'd probably pay to sleep with Richard, and if it was a real first date, I'd probably settle for just the offer. I slipped the $1,000 in cash into my clutch and sank a scalding hot kiss on his lips. That night in the hotel room, Richard got everything he wanted. I was a bad girl and didn't make him use protection. I also got the most genuine 9 hours of rapture I'd ever gotten in my life. There was nothing I wouldn't do for this lover. When I staggered out of his hotel room at 9:15 the next morning, he shoved another $200 in my hand for cab fare and asked if he could call me the next time he was in town. "I'd be really upset if you didn't," I hummed, giving him one last kiss, not too scalding since my lips were sore from frantic kissing. After that, I went over to the bold side of the ledger at Event Inc., even though I was more picky than most other women. Because I was new to the bold side and picky, I was barely making the level of income I needed to maintain the lifestyle I wanted. And then a great opportunity presented itself, if indeed I was brave enough to accept it. Susan met with me about an upcoming bachelor party. They wanted a dancer to pop out of a fake cake, such a cliché, with the expectation that the groom-to-be would be properly catered for. Susan showed me a picture of the groom. He looked to be only 21, which Susan confirmed. He looked good, and even if he wasn't slim, he was far from fat. "It costs $2,000 for 2 hours, she said, "although I must warn you that sometimes visitors also want to lay a pipe. It's entirely up to you, but you'll get $200 for each kiss and $400 for each sex, and 15% of each goes back to Event Inc. I'll have one of my guys act as a waiter to make sure you get compensated and that the situation doesn't get out of hand. Plus, they specifically asked about you when they saw your picture in our selection. Do you agree?" I said yes. That Saturday night at a remote location where Susan's boyfriend, Walter, 6'4", 270 pounds, and with a .357 Magnum hidden under his waiter's uniform, took me, I made sure I was dressed and made up properly and then got into a stupid fake cake. Walter rolled me into the main hall, which filled with joyous shouts and whistles as I was wheeled inside. As soon as the music started, I jumped out of the cake and began to perform my routine. I had been taking aerobics classes since I started working at Event Inc., and even though this was my first time performing in front of such an audience, I was confident. However, the atmosphere in the auditorium was a little intimidating. I was on stage with a light in my eyes, but the room was dark so I could barely see anything, so I had no idea how many guys were there. The only person I could clearly see was the groom-to-be sitting in a chair right in front of the stage with a huge grin on his face. His name was Ben. I must have done a good job, or these guys had never seen big natural breasts before, because throughout my 30-minute performance I was cheered, teased, and applauded. The noise level rose a few decibels, however, when, unclothed, I jumped off the stage to Ben and threw a headlock on him. He grinned in a way I'd never seen before as I unbuckled his belt, slowly pulled off his pants and then his boxers, and had sex with him. As I moved away from my fiancé-to-be, a huge, evil grin appeared on his face, and he continued to admire me. Another young guy came up to me, handed Walter some money, and hugging and caressing me, asked to have sex with him too. I said yes. After him, a third guy came over, and this third guy seemed to really admire me and grabbed my breasts while he had sex with me. It definitely wasn't anything special, even rough, although I pretended to like it. That is, I pretended until he whispered in my ear, "I always knew you were a cheating Amy." I twisted my neck hard and got a good enough look at him to realize it was my ex-husband Chauncey, the asshole. "Let go of me, asshole," I growled, though I doubt anyone but Chauncey heard me through the noise of the crowd, but he wasn't about to stop. "I paid my cheating girlfriend $400, so enjoy it. I always did when we were married. I hope you enjoyed having sex with my nephew Ben. I purposely made him ask you, knowing what a good cheater you are. I just hope you didn't spoil his wife." Things got really bad, however, when guy number 4 growled in my ear. "It feels so good to have sex with my ex-stepmother. I wish I had done it when you were married to Daddy." I recognized the voice. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Mitchell, Chauncey's dorky son. Once I recognized it, I didn't try to pretend to like it anymore, although judging by his grunts and activity, I think Mitchell really did. I was about to get up again when guy number 5 had sex with me. Asshole number 5 turned out to be Julian, the same asshole who drugged me in the Bahamas. Suddenly, it was clear to me. Chauncey had set me up in the Bahamas because he wanted to screw me over and had apparently paid both Julian to drug me and use me and the hospital administrator to submit a false drug test report. I jumped to my feet before the next guy in line could take Julian's place and, as if in a haze, gathered what clothes I could. Despite the protests of the 9-person line, I said to Walter, "Get me out of here." Walter had to pull out his gun to make sure we could get out safely. Once outside the waiting room door, I put on my clothes to get to the car where my regular clothes were, and we hurried out. Walter was very attentive as he drove me back, although it was obvious that he enjoyed looking at my breasts while I changed clothes. I couldn't sleep that night thinking about my ex-asshole, his miserable son, and his friends, and felt completely violated. I was as angry as I'd ever been in my life about the tricks Chauncey had pulled on me to get a divorce and invite my nephew to his bachelor party. I thought, surely Beatrice must have informed him that I worked at Event Inc., adding one more person to my trash list. When I met with Susan the next day, I was all fired up. After she paid me the money, along with a $500 tip from the bachelor party attendees, it took her a good half hour to calm me down. I made it clear that I would never again work an event where my ex or any of his buddies or family were present. In as kind a tone as possible, she informed me that since they had tipped me, I could not refuse in the future, and if I did, I would no longer be able to work at Event Inc. I left without further comment. I was still pondering a few days later when Susan called me and told me that Richard Hawkins would be in town asking about me. After some reflection, when Susan asked, "Are you still there?" I replied, "Susan, I would love to go with Richard, but I won't charge him. Just charge him. I don't need anything." Susan argued with me a bit, but given our meeting earlier in the week and the fact that I was bringing in a lot of money for Event Inc., she agreed. When we met Richard in the reception area of the hotel where the event for which he was in town was being held, he kissed me and then asked, "What's this I hear about you refusing to accept money?" I replied, "It's simple. I really enjoy your company and your love-making skills. I haven't always been a call girl, and I don't intend to be in the future, and I fantasize that perhaps sometime in the future you will consider me something more than a cheater." Was that straightforward enough for you? From the look on his face, I thought I might have made a big mistake. However, I kept my eyes on him. After an awkwardly prolonged duel of glances, he said, "Thank you for your honesty." And then we headed off to the event as if nothing had happened. By the end of the evening, I was euphoric, and he seemed to be too. When we got outside but hadn't gotten into the limo yet, he whispered, "Do you think I'll have as much fun tonight without paying for it?" I grabbed him by his body and growled, "I guarantee it." I managed to fulfill my promise. The sex we were having was so much more intense than any other sex I had ever had in my life that it was like a different experience. Luckily, we had hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, because when we woke up the next morning, at almost the same time, it was 11:30. As luck would have it, he stayed one more night, so he didn't have to check out. That afternoon at brunch, I told Richard about my plight. He recommended an attorney in our beautiful city and even called her to set up an appointment for me. Angela Galini, the attorney, was very helpful. When I described the Chauncey situation, she assured me that it was a classic fraud. After she investigated his background and finances, she would tell me whether or not she would represent me on a contingent fee basis. She also recommended a private investigator I could use for an out-of-court project I had in mind. Over the next 3 months, Angela investigated and prepared a fraud claim that she would file on my behalf against Chauncey and Julian, whose identities she had also established. She delayed filing the fraud claim until I gave her the go-ahead. The statute of limitations was still over a year away. The private investigator I hired found out some very useful information about Chauncey and his son Mitchell, including the fact that Chauncey had married a wealthy socialite who was older than himself and had actually reached childbearing age. So much for the reason he left me. I couldn't have children. I just needed Chauncey to hire Event Inc. again. I knew he would surely do it to punish me even more. 3 weeks after Angela prepared the complaint, I received a call from Susan saying that the social club had called and was asking specifically about me. I asked my private investigator to immediately investigate the club and found out that Chauncey was one of its employees. I immediately found a way to meet Chauncey's new wife, Tinsley Wharton. She kept her maiden name. When I met Tinsley at her country club, she initially regarded me with detachment. However, after I explained to her what had happened at the bachelor party and provided correct information about the date, time, location, etc., she perked up her ears. By the time I finished my hour-long meeting with her, she had already called my private investigator and told him she would pay for the filming of the upcoming event, the nature of which Chauncey had already lied to her about. The social club event was humiliating to me. The only way I could survive it was to remind myself that Chauncey, Mitchell, and Chauncey's nephew Ben would pay dearly for it. After all three had sex with me at a social event, and the private investigator let me know that he had videotape from 2 different angles. The private investigator called security to escort me out of the event while I put on my clothes. Considering the storm of trash that followed, there was no way I would want to get into an unpleasant situation with Tinsley. She crucified Chauncey and also financed the divorces of Megan, Mitchell's wife, and Ben. Angela filed fraud claims against Chauncey and Julian on the same day Tinsley filed for divorce. Angela also had Bahamian authorities send letters to Chauncey and Julian asking them to return to the Bahamas to be interviewed for possible criminal charges against them for drugging and defrauding me. Chauncey saw the handwriting on the wall and made a deal with me for $2,500,000 and paid 1/3 of Angela's fees, and I got a default judgment against Julian when he absconded. Of course, I immediately resigned from Event Inc. I then partnered with my old friend Charlene to develop and market our own line of cosmetics, a business that became very successful in just a couple years. If you were expecting this to be a pretty woman's story where I marry Richard, I'm sorry to disappoint you. While I will always be grateful to Richard for setting me up with Angela, he turned out to be a nasty type. He was married when he met me. His wife got anonymous about what he was doing with me. I don't know if she divorced him or just put him on a short leash. I never bothered to find out. However, my story had a Pollyanna ending. I remarried my first husband, John. Shortly after Charlene and I started our cosmetics business, I met John, now a successful businessman, at a party. We had both matured considerably since our divorce and had started dating. I was completely honest with him about my business after our divorce, and he with me, including cheating on his second wife. We fell in love with each other all over again, and now, with one child that asshole Chauncey paid the OB-GYN he sent me to tell me I couldn't have kids even though I could, and another on the way, we are very happy to have experienced our first love again. This time it will last a long time as we are all grown up and in a great financial position, so we don't have to worry about making ends meet. Life is a strange thing. The end! Subscribe to my channel. Thank you.